Welcome to Crawlspace. I'm Tim here today with Lance. Lance, how's it going today?
It's going fantastic today, Tim. I hope everyone listening is having a wonderful day. But the question of the day is, how are you?
I am doing so well. Thank you very much for asking. I really appreciate it. And Lance, I'm doing especially well because we have one of my very favorite guests on the show. Her name is Maureen Boyle. She is an amazing author. She's local, too, to this area, and she's written a couple of books. This is the second time we've had her on. This is her second book. This one is called The Ghost, The Murder of Police Chief Greg Adams and the Hunt for His Killer. It was released in June of 2021, and it is a wonderful book, Lance, and I highly recommend this to anyone listening to this, and there's links in the show notes. I love speaking with Maureen.
Yeah, agreed. Not much more I can say about that. Really raving about the style of her writing. Anyone who's into true crime will get right into this book. I mean, I think you might have read it or you listened to it on Audible. I definitely listened to it on Audible, and I made the mistake, and I kind of joke about it. I made the mistake of listening to it at like 1.2 speed. And the first few pages of this book, the first chapter, just gets you right into it. Like, she just engages you immediately. There's this anxiety, this sense of urgency. She gets you right in the action. Her writing style comes together like a wonderful piece of noir, like this beautiful, like, cop noir. But it's a true story, and it's tragic, and it's bonkers.
Yeah, very fact-based. The pace is very quick in her writing. It just explains the story, gives very little background on her. And, I think some people really like that. And the book just flies by, and I know you're going to love it. So make sure to check it out. There are links in the show notes. It is about Police Chief Greg Adams from Saxonburg, Pennsylvania, and he was murdered in 1980. And the case is very twisty, and the book is as well. And I just think you're going to find it fascinating. It's a fascinating story.
And because we just raved about the audio version of this book on Audible, shout out to Tom Lennon, who is the narrator. He really takes Maureen's words and puts it into that context and creates that pace that was intended in her writing. So Tom Lennon, great job wherever you are.
And make sure to check out Maureen's site at maureenboylewriter.com. And there are links in the show notes to her website and her books on Amazon. All right, thanks, everybody. Please follow us on social media at Crawlspace Pod or Crawlspace Podcast. We're going to play a quick commercial break here, and we'll be right back with Maureen Boyle. Welcome back to the podcast, Maureen Boyle. How are you today, Maureen?
Doing very well. Thank you for having me back.
Yeah, absolutely. It's always a pleasure to speak with you. We had you on a previous show for your book Shallow Graves about the New Bedford highway serial killer, which really opened up the eyes of a lot of listeners, including Tim and I, that was even a thing. You wouldn't even believe how many people reached out to us and said, I live 2 minutes away, and I didn't know that this actually happened. So well done on that.
Thank you very much. A part of the case with Shallow Graves is, unfortunately, it happened during the 1980s when there wasn't a lot of social media. Well, there was no social media, so people weren't familiar with the case unless you were right in the middle of it. So I'm hoping that as many people as possible know about the case. Perhaps eventually it'll get solved.
Great. And your newest book, The Ghost, is about an unsolved murder. And before we get into the story, can you tell us why you chose this story?
I found it intriguing. I had just finished Shallow Graves, and I was looking for another project, as if I hadn't had enough work to do prior to that. And this case came along. The solution of the case came along. And I'm like, oh, this is interesting, because I was familiar with the very beginning, part of the beginning of the case, but not really. In 1984, I joined the Standard Times down in New Bedford, and eventually I was the police reporter for many, many years. And I was not familiar with this case, which I was absolutely, number one, appalled with myself, but I'm also appalled with everyone else who not telling me there's this unsolved case, this fugitive that's wanted out there. What happened was in 1980, a police chief in Saxonburg, Pennsylvania, stopped the car about a block and a half away from the police station. It was in December, a couple of weeks before Christmas, and pulled them over into a Agaway parking lot, and a fight ensued, and the chief was fatally shot, and the killer drove off. They found a driver's license in the snow later on during a search, and it turned out to be an alias that was used by a man named Donald Webb, who lived in New Bedford, Massachusetts. Saxonburg is roughly 10 hours away from Saxonburg. So in this case, they knew who the killer was. They thought initially they'd be able to catch him right away, but they didn't. And it took decades before he was finally located. It brought in the FBI. Webb was on one of the top 10 fugitives for quite some time. The FBI was working on it, Pennsylvania State Police, Massachusetts State Police, and no one could catch him. And what was also very interesting about the case is that as I was doing the research and looking through old newspapers on microfiche, there was no news story, very few news stories about it, like two early on, two. So that people in the community, if they knew Donald Webb, they would not have known that he was wanted. I mean, that wouldn't happen today because it would be on Twitter and it would be on Facebook and it would be on whatever the next, hot social media platform there is. But then people relied on TV, radio, and local newspapers. And very few people looked on the post office wall for who's wanted by the FBI. So most people, other than the circle that knew Donald Webb, most people had no idea who he was and that he was wanted. When I was a reporter, some of the older reporters, people who had been there much longer and who were native to the community, would talk about Donald Webb's stepson because he had been a New Bedford cop and he left the department under some pressure. So people would talk about him and then in passing say, oh yeah, and his stepfather killed a cop. And no one really said flat out, and he's still out there and he's still wanted. So I wrongly assumed that Donald Webb was either dead or he was in prison. I had no idea that he was still wanted.
Wow.
Because I would have done stories about it.
Right. Okay. At what point in your research did you find out that this story had a connection to New Bedford, which is, of course, a big part of the subject of your first book?
Yep. The very start, because he was eventually located in New Bedford, and I knew of the New Bedford ties. So I went backwards. I went knowing what was going on in New Bedford, and then going backwards and learning much more about who Chief Adams was, what was Saxonburg like, what was the toll that the murder took on the community, what efforts were being done to try and find Donald Webb. That was very, very enlightening to me, to go to Saxonburg, which is a lovely little community. It really is. It's very quaint. Everyone knows everyone. One person described Saxonburg as it's Mayberry, USA. And before I went there, and when I went there, that is exactly what it is.
You definitely paint the picture of that idyllic community of Saxonburg. And my next question was, who was Greg Adams? Because you introduce him right off the bat in your story, and you get right to the story. I mean, it is, I was joking around with Tim that I was listening to it on Audible, and I made the mistake of listening to it at 1.3 speed. and it was giving me anxiety because it you get right into it.
It's riveting, yeah.
And it doesn't slow down. Anyway, back to the point of my question. Can you tell us a little bit about Chief Adams?
He was married. He had 2 small children. He was someone who always did everything right. He went to church. He honored his parents. He would have Sunday dinner with them. He was very much a family man. In addition to working as a police chief, he also taught at the academy. He was a volunteer firefighter. So he was very much involved with the community. He was going to school. He got his master's degree. He was then going to pursue a law degree. But when his wife got pregnant, he said, well, it'll be too crazy. The household will be too crazy. So he gave up his dream of becoming a lawyer, but he was very, very dedicated to Saxonburg and being the head of the police department, of which there was only 2 full-time officers on the department, the chief and another officer. Overall, good guy, straight and narrow, the complete opposite of Donald Webb, who was a low-level mobster who, broke into buildings and, ripped people off and once robbed a bank, would scam people.
And he was pretty young, right?
Yes, he was in his 30s, early 30s.
Wow. Yeah, the beginning of your book is absolutely riveting, and hearing sort of some of the accounts of what Chief Adams went through when he died was just heartbreaking. Talking about his kids and he's not going to be able to see them, and that part really grabbed me right away, and I felt awful for Chief Adams.
And for all of the people that knew him, who were, because it's a small town, the people who ran the ambulance were cops and firefighters and volunteers, and they knew him, and they were desperately trying to save him the entire time. And they had to live and relive those moments all these years, partially because they felt if the case when the case came to trial, they'd have to testify. So, decade after decade, they were keeping that memory alive in their head, which is very remarkable and horrifying at the same time, because you could never put it behind you if you ever can. But they had to always relive it. And I think the town constantly relived it every single year when the anniversary of his murder came up, and there was no closure.
Tell us about what clues were left at the crime scene that sort of started the chase, I guess.
One of the first things that they found was the driver's license in the snow. And the driver's license was had the name Stanley Portis on it. And it had a Massachusetts address. The FBI agent in Pennsylvania knew it was very close to another agent who was in New Bedford, Massachusetts. And he called him and said, we have a police chief here who's murdered. It looks like it may be someone who's your way. He gives them the name, and the agent then calls over to the Massachusetts State Police unit that's assigned to the district attorney's office at the time and talks to the person in charge. And he gives the name, and the person in charge tells him, oh, that's, you know who that is. That's, the first husband of the dead husband of Donald Webb's wife. And sometimes he uses that alias. Now, unfortunately, the FBI didn't realize that that particular member of the state police knew Webb's wife and promptly called her. And it's kind of unclear exactly what he said, but the bottom line is at that point, she knew that he was wanted for murder, and that a number of investigators said really set the case back in that very initial stage. They lost the element of surprise.
Wow, right, because Stanley Portis wasn't even alive at that point. So now, I guess some of this would be speculation, but if they called and told her, we found this ID. Like maybe they didn't assume right away what happened, right?
Well, what it is the person in the state police knew that Stanley Portis was dead, because he knew the wife. The wife was a waitress at a local restaurant. New Bedford is a small city, and just about everyone knows everyone. There's always that third degree of separation. And the person that was lieutenant who was in charge of the unit personally knew Webb's wife. So when he called her and said, "Hey, they're looking for Donald. They found, your dead husband's driver's license, and that's
right.
Donald must have left it someplace." You can only assume what the conversation was. He may have said, "Hey, but when you see him, please tell him to give us a call." And of course, she was no fool. She knew, oh, this is not good, and something bad is going on. And it's obviously her husband was not going to give the state police a call or the FBI a call.
Right. So it was kind of common knowledge that Donald was using Stanley's identification.
Yeah, he used a variety of different aliases, but that one was used quite often.
And without giving anything away for someone who wants to read the book, how does someone go about their day-to-day life with that being just common knowledge that this is the type of person you are?
It's amazing. I couldn't do it. There are a number of people who can, which I find fascinating, but he was kept hidden for decades. And it's by his wife. I still can't wrap my head around how no one turned him in. Part of me can understand why his wife didn't turn him in, but there must have been other people who saw him around, and there was a reward being offered. You would think someone would drop a dime, but no one did.
How many times did that happen to you when you were researching for this book, where you came upon like just a baffling detail like that? Like, why is this happening like this? I mean, how emotionally invested did you get in this one?
I was quite emotionally invested, particularly with the people from Saxonburg, because their stories of how horrendous the murder was and the toll it took on the community really, really resonated with me. And then when I'm looking at how Donald Webb was able to get away for so long, that really bothered me, because I love the city of New Bedford. It is a lovely city. It really is. Aside from the fact that there was a serial killer, and aside from that, things happen.
Name me a city that doesn't have a serial killer.
Yes. Yes, there's many that we don't even know about. But it really is. It's a city where there's a lot of very hardworking people, and who will have your back, who will help you. It's on a beautiful coast. I call it Massachusetts' best kept secret. And I think everyone in that area wants to keep it that way, because once it's discovered, what happens. Houses go up, and everything gets ruined. The people who live there can't live there. But I was really quite surprised with this case that this, unlike the serial killings, where there was a number of people, they really wanted this case to be solved, and they were puzzled why no one was coming forward. And it seemed that no one knew who the killer is. While in this case, they knew who the killer was, and people just were refusing to say where he was. There was a lot of false starts. At one point, they thought that he was in gambling up in Canada, and there was sightings of him on vacation or on a cruise, or in a variety of places, and they all turned out to be not true. To this day, I'm still absolutely baffled that he could have escaped justice for so long in a community like New Bedford. I still don't understand it. And I'm sure part of it had to do with that people just didn't know that he was wanted. the shocker was not seeing anything in newspapers. I was expecting to see, these, front page headlines, most wanted, maybe in New Bedford, maybe in the area. Nothing.
Right.
The first story I found was in the Fall River paper, and it was an inside story. And it was very, very short. It was more of a rewrite of a press release than anything else. And I was just, you contrast that with the news that was in Pennsylvania, where it was day after day after day after day of, where's the killer? They're still looking here, they're looking there. And by that time, Donald Webb was way, way long gone. He was not even in Pennsylvania. He was up in Massachusetts.
Do you think it was common knowledge that he was sort of involved in organized crime?
Use the term organized crime loosely. There's organized crime, like The Godfather, organized crime.
Right.
And then you have the lower level organized crime members. And he was more of the lower level organized crime member. He was not the way up on the top calling the shots. He had his own little crew who would, break into businesses and break into jewelry stores at night. And they were very, very successful. They were good at what they did. And the police called them the Fall River Gang because most of the members were from Fall River. It's, not a particularly unique name, but that's what they called them.
And was there a connection to the Providence Mafia as well, or the, organized crime?
For people who aren't familiar with the geography here, New Bedford and Fall River are on the south coast of Massachusetts. It's really closer to Providence and to Boston. So it's about 40 minutes from Providence. And they were tied to loosely tied to the Patriarcha family. They hung out with some of the same people, not the, people that were high up, but they sort of touched the Patriarcha family.
Yeah, it's a pretty significant crime family, right? Especially at that time.
Yes, it is.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's come up in some of our Gardner heist research. Yeah.
That's a fascinating case too.
Yeah, it really
imagine
is.
Someone stealing this and probably not realizing what you have, and could be buried someplace, and that is just a truly bizarre case.
When you writing a book on it?
Oh, there's been so many books written on that that are absolutely wonderful books. I probably won't.
Okay, well, if you do, let us know.
Oh, I definitely will.
And we'll be right back after a quick word from our sponsors.
Thanks to our sponsors, and now we're back to the program. And there's no chance that New Bedford Highway serial killer case is connected to Webb, right?
You know what? It's funny. I thought the same thing. Oh, is that possible? Which gives you an idea of how, when you're looking at suspects, it could be anyone. Because I was thinking, and I that was one of the first things I asked some investigators, could he have been the highway killer? And that would make sense in some ways because no one knew he was around. But some of the investigators said, no, he wasn't, violent. The killing of the chief was in some ways a bit an accident because they were struggling with a gun. But who knows? You never leave anything out of the realm of possibility, which tells you how many suspects there are out there as for the New Bedford Highway serial killing, and how that can be so haunting. And my brain is always going, could this be the person? Could that be the person? So it did cross my mind.
And you had mentioned that the murder of Greg Adams probably was an accident because there was a struggle with the weapon. Can you break down, again, without giving away too much from the book, can you break down what did happen that morning?
Yes, the chief had left the courthouse where the police station at that time was housed, and he went out on parole on patrol. And soon after, it came over the radio that a police officer had been shot. Everyone in the community, all the law enforcement, rushed right to the scene. An alarm went out. Ambulance, which was a block and a half away at the fire station, they all jumped. One person jumped in there and went there. Someone else, a volunteer firefighter who was the closest, was first on the scene and began trying to save the chief. He was found in this way. After he had stopped this vehicle, and the vehicle was pulled into the parking lot, they believe that, and this is all speculation, of course, that the chief took the guy's Webb's fake license and was turning around and was going to his vehicle to call it in. Now, at the time, Donald Webb was wanted for skipping bail on some New York robberies, and he may have thought, "I'm not going back to prison." And when the chief came back, something happened and there was a struggle and they were fighting. And the struggle and fight ended up behind some houses right next door to the parking lot. And then Webb took off. The chief was lying wounded in the back of one of the houses, and he was calling for help. And a young boy who was homesick heard a noise outside and then heard a voice calling, "Help, help." And he told his mother. Eventually they went outside and they found the chief, and they called the station. And then that set up the whole search at that point.
It's a really harrowing moment in your book where you're describing them taking him to the hospital, going up to 80 miles an hour on icy roads, and realizing at that moment that the ambulance they were in was pretty much, I think it was described as like a mobile Band-Aid, where it didn't have any real equipment for life-saving on it. Do you think that without placing, I'm not trying to place any blame on anybody, but do you think if this was a more equipped department that he would have survived?
I think if it happened today.
Yeah, that's probably a better way to put it. Yeah.
If it had happened today, he may have survived. If it happened today, Webb would have been caught much sooner because of social media and because of surveillance and a whole variety of other things. Because remember, in 1980, it was a whole different world when it came to law enforcement. Most departments didn't even have computers. And that's the one troubling thing about the whole stop itself. For a lot of departments, today, if you get stopped, it's a couple of keystrokes by the cops in the cruiser. They call up your license, any warrants, tickets. Is your license really good? But back then, some of the smaller departments, when they would stop someone, they would have to radio it in, and sometimes a dispatcher would then have to physically call someone else to look up the information. And sometimes that just wasn't done. So there was a good chance that Donald Webb panicked and not knowing the whole procedure. And if he had just stayed cool, there's a good chance he could have just gone off on his merry way and the chief would have been alive.
Oh, that's tragic.
That really is tragic.
So tell us about how the police went about trying to track Donald Webb.
They went to, first, all of his friends, his wife. They staked out his wife's house. They watched her very, very carefully. And they described it as very often she would take elusive measures when she was driving. And they were quite impressed with her driving ability and the measures that she took. When she would leave her driveway, pull out of the garage, or pull into her garage, the garage door would go down immediately. When she went out, she was already in the car and would pull out. They followed her quite often, especially in those early days. They had electronic surveillance cameras trained on her home. They did just about everything that they could, but they never caught sight at all of Donald Webb or any indication of where he was or if he was in her home. They talked to the neighbors. They would set up surveillance around the area to see if they could catch a glimpse of him. And there was a good chance during part of that really heavy surveillance, he wasn't even at the home or even in the city. That he was nearby, but it was not there. And they believed that he was coming and going because there were sightings or possible sightings of him in Pennsylvania, New York, and some other areas, including Canada. So they were following up on all of these different things.
You had said that he had made the FBI's most wanted list. How soon after the murder had that happened?
Within a year.
Oh, so pretty quick.
Oh, pretty quickly. Yeah, pretty quickly.
And I take it the way he moved around, sort of ghost-like, I guess, is why you titled the book The Ghost?
I titled the book The Ghost for two different reasons. The town of Saxonburg had been really haunted by the memory of Greg Adams. So he was sort of the ghost in the community. And also his killer, Donald Webb, was dubbed the ghost by law enforcement because he just seemed to vanish. They would get word that he would be here, and they go there and he's gone. At one point they thought they got word that he was going to be at a party, a New Year's Eve party, and they're watching and watching. They had really good intelligence on it. And because there was certain other things that happened, and they missed him, he got away.
If this was the same time, he rolled out of the car, if that's to be believed?
Yeah, there was a party, it was supposed to be a party on Cape Cod, New Year's Eve party, where some folks from Providence were going to be there. And it was at a hotel. The state police and some members of the FBI, they had rooms all around there. So they were watching this area very, very closely. And they were waiting for him to show up. And he was supposed to be there with a certain person. And they saw a vehicle pull up, and they thought that they saw Donald Webb in there. And they're waiting, and a local cruiser went by, and it spooked the driver. And they went around the back, and when the car came back out, there was only one person in the car. And they later were told that Webb was in the car and he rolled out of the vehicle and took off. Now, whether that's true or not, that's the story they were told. So there were a lot of cases where it was like they almost got him. And he was just very, very lucky. So many times, very, very, very lucky.
And you have visited the town of Saxonburg, Pennsylvania. You said that it was Mayberry-like, I believe you said. Have you spoken with members of Adams' family, his sons, or anybody surviving?
Yes, I've interviewed his widow for the book, and the death of her husband really just changed the whole trajectory of her life. She was a young mother. She had a certain vision of how her life was going to be. And then, within hours, all that changed, and she becomes a widow with two young children. And these boys really never knew their father. The oldest was, just a toddler, so his memories of his father are very hazy. And the youngest was an infant, so he has no memory of his father, which is really just heartbreaking, absolutely heartbreaking. And, here she is forced now to come to terms with her husband being dead and raising her boys and trying to find work and survive while still, dealing with this absolute tragedy. She was a really strong, lovely woman who deserved answers in 1980 and 81, not so many years later. She's tough, and she is very much a survivor. To the credit of everyone in Saxonburg, they never forgot the chief. Every year, there would be a ceremony on the day of his murder, where they would lay a wreath on a memorial that they have in front of the police department. They have renamed the street that he was killed on in his honor. They have not forgotten him. And when we were there after the book came out, the stories that people would tell of the chief were really heartwarming. And to the people in Saxonburg, it's like this just happened yesterday. And it's truly, truly sad. It really was. And it was heartbreaking because it touched so many people, from law enforcement to the judges, to cops, to people on the street. They all knew him and were touched by him. And for a murder like this to happen in a quiet community like Saxonburg was just unthinkable, because this is a community where, you could imagine people not locking their doors. This is a type of town it is. They are, someone described it as, this is in Saxonburg, they have a parade for a parade. They are always celebrating something. And so it's very community oriented. And so the chief was just the exact opposite of who Donald Webb was.
Right. Yeah. And how the heck did Webb move around and stay uncaught, I guess, for so long?
Clearly he had help. No one would admit to helping him, but clearly he had help. And, clearly his wife knew where he was. She was under no obligation to tell the police where he was under Massachusetts law. So there was never any doubt amongst the investigators that she knew where he was, but she was not talking at all. She was very, very loyal to him. And that's something that he had noted when he was in prison in Massachusetts early on, that she was very, very loyal. And she was probably admitted that she was the best thing that ever happened to him in his life. And she was, so loyal to him, and he didn't quite understand it.
Huh. Can you explain a little bit more what you mean when you say she was under no obligation by Massachusetts law to reveal where her husband was?
Yeah, because they were married and spousal privilege.
Spousal privilege? That is mind blowing to me that this guy could be on the FBI's top 10 most dangerous, most wanted list, and you're married to somebody and you're like, yeah, that supersedes the FBI.
Yeah.
Wow.
But however, if she lied to the FBI, she could be charged with lying to the FBI.
Oh, so it's like, just don't say anything.
Don't say anything. See, this is the thing with the FBI. You always have to tell them the truth. That is the trap door with the FBI. You lie to the FBI and you can wind up in prison, or you get charged for lying to the FBI.
I bet I could get away with it.
Never lie to the FBI.
Good advice.
Right. If you're ever in the position where you are considering lying to the FBI,
do not do it. Under no
Yeah.
circumstances.
Okay.
I'm making notes here.
Sometimes they charge, sometimes they don't. It depends on the circumstances. In this case, she was not charged with lying to the FBI, but that's the discretion that they could have.
I guess when you come right down to the letter of the law, technically she was not lying to the FBI.
Well,
Maybe
A little bit.
it's a fine line there.
Okay.
It's a very fine line. But they would say she wasn't cooperating with them, that's for sure.
Either way, the guy totally lucked out with her.
Yes, he did. He really did. And she is a very strong woman also, because when her first husband died, she had a small child. She had an infant. And during that period of time in the 1950s, things were very different for women than how they are today. So for her to have prevailed on her own as a single mother is really shows some of her inner strength. You have to look at all of it in the lens of the times too.
Right.
Yeah.
And you do wonder if she had never met Donald Webb, how her life might have been different.
Right. So Greg Adams' widow, Mary, she filed a lawsuit later?
Yeah, she did. As they were trying to force the Webb's wife's hand in this, she filed a civil suit to force Mrs. Webb to cooperate. That's what it was seen as, and that they were going to attach all of her money and her property and all of that. So that helped to bring a closure to the case, which was interesting, an interesting ending. And I won't talk about the ending because it is truly bizarre.
Yeah.
To say the least.
Okay, cool. Yeah, we won't go too much further there.
But you will agree that is the strangest ending to a case ever.
It's extremely bizarre.
We're not so much in your, I guess, investigative journalistic shoes, but we do experience a lot of true crime. Obviously, that's what we do in this podcast biz, but pretty rare you get something that's it's on par with the most bizarre. Yeah.
Yes. Yeah. Yeah. It is sort of like, oh, really? It's a strange one, and that's why I wrote the book.
My only remaining question for you is, what are you working on now? What case are you diving into? What can we look forward to coming next?
I'm working on 3 different projects. One of them is almost done. It is Pennsylvania-based, and it involves the disappearance of a teenage girl in 1965. And it is a case where authorities believe they knew who the killer was because they believed that she was dead. But they did not have a body, and they didn't have enough evidence to charge the person. And it wasn't until 1987 that they got a tip, which led to the unraveling of the case and eventually a conviction. But so that's the next one. And then I'm working on 2 other ones. One is a historic murder set in New Hampshire, and another story about a convicted sex offender who abducted a teenager and killed her.
And do you have any upcoming events? I know you're busy out there with book signings and things like that.
I do. I have 2 events in May. One is a virtual event on May 10th through the Franklin, Massachusetts Library. And there is another event on May 24th at the Warwick, Rhode Island Library at 2 p.m. And if anyone wants to reach out to me, they can reach me through Twitter, Instagram, or on my Facebook page, Maureen Boyle Writer.
And I do have just one more quick question. A conversation with you is so calming. You are such a calming presence. But your books are like so intense. And it's hard for me to say like this is the same person who wrote like the opening scene of The Ghost. Is there like a place that you go to mentally, like emotionally, when you do just like lock in? How do you get that out?
It is. I do have to put it in a different spot in my head, because I always have to remember this isn't my life. I'm telling the stories of other people, and I have to tell that story. I do have to maintain some mental distance so that you don't freeze. You get so overwhelmed that you can't tell the story, that you get so anxiety ridden because I'm telling the story. I didn't live the story. So I get close enough in the story where you sort of feel the heat. There was a discussion I had many, many years ago with some colleagues at a newspaper I was working at in New Hampshire. We were talking about covering crime. And it was, especially when you're dealing with victims, that to tell the story properly, it's like touching a flame, and you get really close enough where you can feel the heat of it, but you can't get so close that you get burned, because then you can't tell the story. That's how I do it, and keep on getting as much detail from the victims and from the witnesses, and work as best as I can to tell their story, because it's their story, not my story. I'm just the conduit to the telling, and hopefully I do them justice.